Okay, this is going to be the most important panel of the day. Jen doesn't like me saying that, but you know, while we're seeing a cooling of the trade war out there, the tech war seems to be heating up. It has potentially huge implications for the coming decades and really the future of the world. And we have a really distinguished panel to talk about it. And Deborah, I'm going to put you on the spot first. You're at the Paulson Institute. Hank Paulson said a year ago, he talked about an economic iron curtain. It's beginning to look like what we're talking about is a tech iron curtain. What are the implications of that?
Certainly. So last year, my boss, Hank Paulson, talked about the potential of an economic iron curtain across 4 areas of flows, technology being one of them, but trade, people, and investment. And since last year, we haven't really seen any improvement. In fact, I would argue that maybe we have seen it get worse. On the trade front, yes, there's the potential, and I say potential of a phase 1 agreement, but anybody who knows Donald Trump knows the only thing that is consistent about him is that he's inconsistent. And the fact that we haven't had a deal that's been signed yet is very concerning, particularly now that the APEC isn't going to happen. And so that could unravel. But assuming it will go forward, and I think the president does want to see it go forward to create some positive momentum, it creates an opportunity to start to address some of the other difficult issues, technology being one of them. It's not part of the trade agreement. And there are many things that are coming out that are going to cause further friction between the United States and China. For example, and I'm sure Paul will talk a lot about this, the Commerce Department is coming out with rules around emerging technologies and how to put fences around U.S. technology in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, big data, and those could be a big fence around a very large field, or it could be high walls around a small field. We hope it's the latter for our own U.S. competitiveness, but we don't know, and it could turn into a very difficult situation.
She set you up, Paul. I mean, how high is the fence? How long is this going to last?
Right. Well, I think, you know, when we talk about this issue with technology and U.S.-China relations, I think there's really 4 or 5 big areas that baskets we put them into. So there's the trade issues that also involve technology issues, right? Like market access, subsidies under Made in China 2025. So there are technologies at the heart of the trade issues. But there are also other issues that have become more salient in the last, particularly, year and a half or 2 years. One is around supply chains. So there's been this perception in the U.S. that too many supply chains, ICT supply chains, technology supply chains are centered in China. And so that's a big problem that has led to some measures within the U.S. government, executive orders around supply chain security, which will essentially act against Chinese companies participating in some U.S. both government and private sector supply chains. And then there's a technology control issue, which Deborah mentioned, around tightening of export control laws and financial reviews, for example, of investment in tech companies in the U.S. And last year we've seen a lot of movement there. That's where the export control piece comes in. And then I think there's also this perception that we're in this zero-sum long-term technology competition between the U.S. and China and cutting-edge areas like 5G that we talked about this morning, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. And that narrative has really gained traction, particularly in Washington, D.C. And so every gain in China in a complex sector like AI is seen as somehow a loss for the U.S. And so I think that's helping to drive this narrative. And then these other issues like financial services have become also salient, Chinese tech companies listing in the U.S. and whether they're subject to the same transparency and auditing laws as U.S.
And Paul, just to be clear, the tech issues in particular are not tied to Donald Trump. They will last long after he's gone.
Yes, I mean, the president is really focused on the trade deficit, but the others in the administration, like some of the economic advisors like Peter Navarro, these guys are what we call supply chain nativists. They want to do things like decouple supply chains and reduce that dependence on China.
So G.A. and Ben, I want to ask you both the same question. If that's the world we're moving into, decoupling 2 separate ecosystems, fairly high walls between them, who wins and who loses?
I believe there's no winner in this trade war. And I think the trade war really is a tech war. Without the tech conflicts and the misunderstanding about each other, there wouldn't be a trade war, in my opinion. And I don't think there will be any winners.
So what, if we're all losers, what are the main ramifications?
I don't have a good one, but I think because there's a lot of misunderstandings, and the misunderstanding basically comes from why there's a rise of China's technology development and the consequence of it. And based on my past experience in supporting early stage technology companies, including DJI, I see three very important advantages of China's technology development. Namely, its manufacturing ecosystem, which consists of a very good supply chain, plus logistics and production. The second is relatively cheap engineers, which I call mid to high and laborers. And the third one is the huge market and the resulting rich set of applications for new technologies. So China's rise is based on that. All these have nothing to do with IP theft, with forced technology transfer, or even government subsidies. So these are the reasons behind the rise of China's technology.
But there certainly have been issues with intellectual property.
Oh yeah, but China's
appropriation, if we want to use a softer word.
Both to foreign companies as well as to existing Chinese companies. Yeah. But I don't think the rise of China's technology development depends on that. Yeah. Or that's the driving force behind that. And I think these three advantages also point to the weakness and strengths of China's current state of technology. The strength is that Chinese are very quick in turning ideas into products based on implementation, which is a huge market because of the rich set of applications in China. But on the other hand, it also points to a weakness, which is there's not a very solid and powerful fundamental research, I would say, or engineering know-how. So it's more application-based, and in the most advanced technology area, China is still lagged behind. For example, semiconductor, which we have witnessed, as well as a lot of the core parts for high-end machining tools, which is churning out Barbie dolls, churning out iPhones, and so on. Yeah. So all these are saying Chinese companies are really staying still at the low end of the value chain. And American companies are grabbing the high end. So I would say we call it a divide, but the divide is not that great in terms of economic.
You also seem to be saying they need each other.
They need each other, exactly. And there's a comparative advantage, which has implications for international specialization, which has been going quite well.
Our president skipped that course.
Exactly, yeah, that's right. Econ 101.
Ben, so if this divide is going to continue, who wins, who loses?
I think in the long term, the scoreboard's going to show. In the short term, China is being hurt by these decisions, by cutting off, for instance, core components to Chinese mobile phone makers, by restricting access to investment in the United States and a lot of that core IP that was fueling a lot of the development around here as well. But I think in the long term, the loser is the United States. I think that forcing self-sufficiency for the Chinese by decoupling supply chains, capital markets, talent, ultimately breeds a system internally of self-sufficiency for China. That capital and talent ends up coming home. And ultimately, that is used not only to develop native industries and build dominant global players locally, but it then is used to address emerging technology markets, where I believe the real battleground lies when we look at a scoreboard.
It probably also creates investment opportunities for you, right?
Right. So, I mean, it's been a saturated market on the consumer internet front, mobility fronts anyway in China over the last few years. And so where the investment is going today and where the capital is flowing today is in these replacement self-sufficiency industries, chips, quantum computing, AI, for all kinds of different applications, from city planning to financial services to drug discovery.
Paul, one of the questions I wonder about is whether this divide is almost inevitable given the difference in values in the two countries around things like data privacy, public surveillance, free expression. There are a number of them. Would we have inevitably gotten to a divide?
Probably some level of divide. I think the big question is how deep the divide goes. I think Ben mentioned financial markets, the decoupling of supply chains, other things. But I think that something like data and data privacy, that's a really fundamental issue where, for example, China remains outside of global best practices on data. And so I think the challenge is going to be there's still time for China's data governance regime, for example, to come into line with things like the GDPR in Europe, the cross-border privacy rules in Asia. But if something doesn't happen there, that's going to be a problem. And in the trade talks, they were talking about getting to start talking about these issues. So those are not insoluble problems, but they're being driven by perception that China is also misusing some of these technologies, like artificial intelligence, for some certain applications in terms of monitoring minority populations, that kind of thing. So I think there's a narrative that's very much about values, but I think the real trick will be for China to try to come into some of the global best practices around data. Chinese companies do that. Lehr, for example, who we talked to this morning on the panel, they're GDPR compliant internally, but China as a whole will probably not be judged compliant on data. So the question is, how do you bridge some of the gaps in how China is implementing things like data privacy?
Any of the rest of you have thoughts on how you deal with the fundamental values divide in the tech debate?
Well, I don't know about the values, but I'd like to say just something about the use of this word war that we talk about a lot. Because the reality is, I mean, when you're talking about a military term like war, it means you have a winner and a loser, and the goal, if the winner, is to destroy the loser. And if we're setting up the United States and China for that kind of scenario, then we're all in trouble. Really, the issue is in trade, usually, in business, you're strategic competitors. One day you're competing against each other, one day you're competing with each other. And that really needs to be the kind of framework we want to see if we're going to look at global economic growth. But I would agree with Ben that where we're going to really see this play out is not so much between the United States and China, but emerging markets. As we see competition and as we see China being much more active overseas, as its commercial interests go overseas, its foreign policy is going along with it, and we're starting to see differing views, for example, in the Middle East. As China goes in and as Huawei is setting up the 5G networks in countries in the Middle East, yet the U.S. has a military presence there, do we see one day where the United States military can no longer communicate with the militaries in the region because they're on different networks? And it's these kinds of scenarios, I think, where we envision as we look ahead a potential iron curtain. Economic.
The problem we find, exactly to piggyback on Deborah, is that the American decoupling moment is happening just at the wrong time. The rest of the world has woken up now in the emerging markets to the fact that Chinese built, backed, or inspired business models are what going to dominate in those markets, from Indonesia to India to South Africa and Nigeria. And so as America kind of detracts and pulls away from the Chinese side, it leaves the Chinese standing alone as the only viable alternative for those markets, not just for things like 5G, which has obviously become a little cliche, but also just in terms of where the capital is coming from, where the inspiration is coming from. So when we talk to emerging market entrepreneurs today that once were heavily oversubscribed, and in order to curry favor with them, you had to tell them, I know this guy in Silicon Valley and I know this company in New York that I can connect you with. 18 months ago started a trend where now it's who do you know in China, and what Chinese business model can you instruct me on? And with that will come a whole slew of other knock-on effects, as Deborah mentioned, from that connection.
This win-lose rhetoric is very much been adopted by the governments on both sides, right? I hear both sides saying we have to win the war for 5G. We have to win the war for AI. I mean, these have become matters of national pride and national strategy. How do you get out of that?
Well, I think that it's a great question. I think that there is particularly AI is a good example, I think, where there's a fundamental misunderstanding of how AI is developing both in the U.S. and China. And that is basically a lot of collaboration. If you look at research conferences where the papers are co-authored by Chinese and U.S. authors, most of the Chinese leading AI companies are headed by people who went through Microsoft Research Asia, who have close ties to Silicon Valley. So there's a tremendous amount amount of collaboration, because it's sort of a developing field. It's a very small, it's not a very big field. But I think the perception is in the U.S., and probably prematurely, is that somehow China is leveraging AI for military purposes, right? When if you look really hard at that, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot going on there. Almost everything in China, for example, in AI is in the commercial sector. It may be surveillance and other things, but it's also, as we heard today, things like medicine and medical applications and healthcare, which is going to be a big area. So I think that one of the problems is that the level of dialogue on AI, a topic as complicated as AI, is very binary. It's a little bit too simplistic, I think. I did a paper with Kai-Fu Lee about a year and a half ago where we tried to look at AI, break it down into the different fields, perception AI, business model AI. Each one of these has a different dynamic and different levels of collaboration. And so I think there's sort of a general lack of nuance in the discussion around these complicated issues, and a misunderstanding of the degree to which U.S. companies are very intertwined with Chinese companies, whether it's semiconductors or whether it's AI.
Yeah, trying to win is always politically correct in both countries. And I think this has to do with the point that you raised earlier about value system. As someone who lived and educated in the U.S. for a long time, and then grew up.
You did your graduate work at MIT.
Yeah, that's right. And then went back to China to work. I would say I see the differences in value and even way of thinking. Something that's very much driving the differences in opinions on the negotiation table. I think some enhanced mutual understanding is important, and unbiased media is also important. What we see, I'm sure what Americans are seeing based on news reports in the US will be very different from people like Ben, who has been in China for many years and doing investments and fully understand things. So I think somehow a better bridge in terms of communication would really help. And on the Chinese side, it's also the same, to truly understand how the American system works. Donald Trump may not represent the whole American system, but oftentimes once you get into a fight that's escalated to a political level, it's kind of always winning versus losing.
I just think if you look at something like the report on AI that was submitted to Congress last week, there's a lot of tough rhetoric in there. That didn't feel to me like a report about building bridges. It was a report more about building walls. And that didn't come from the president. That came from a bipartisan panel. But on AI, it seems you were talking about the need for cooperation. There's still a sense that fundamental research in AI is stronger in the U.S., but implementation, access to data, rapid speed to market is better in China. That seems like an area where if the two separate, we may really suffer.
And I think that's to America's detriment. I mean, that's where we're starting to see, because of what was previously referred to as kind of uncertainty that exists in America today on a regulatory front and policy level. A lot of teams we're talking to are now saying, we want to limit the coding that we do in the United States to under that 20% threshold so that we are not deemed an American business, and so that we can keep the core IP outside the US purview. And we're seeing talent that was previously coming out of Intel and Qualcomm and should be sitting in San Diego today, coming back to China and building chip companies locally because of that uncertainty. We talked to researchers in American universities today that report feelings of a red scare, where there's the perception that if there is a Chinese-born national working on a U.S. research team, even on something that is not of national security importance, something even critically life-saving like cancer drugs, that there might be a withdrawing of funding from federal sources. And so as a result of that, a lot of that is now coming home, and to everyone's detriment. I mean, America was always the country that accepted and welcomed global.
But you say to everyone's detriment, but it seems pretty clearly that you think that the bigger loss is going to be on the U.S. side.
I mean, at the end of the day, if America is not the hub of innovation and where the world's best minds feel welcome to come and be funded and supported, that's to our detriment. But it doesn't help China in the long term either, because really diverse intercultural teams end up making better outcomes than siloed individual teams.
Right, and there's also a national security argument, which is that, for example, U.S. semiconductor companies rely for 36% of their overall revenue on China. And so if as a result of some of these US government policy actions, like actions against Huawei and other Chinese companies, they're going to design out essentially US technology, then that's going to have a huge impact on those companies' bottom line, because a lot of that money they're making in China is being plowed back into R&D in the US to continue to innovate. And so that's one of those sort of dynamic, beneficial supply chain and sort of flows of capital and people that if it's disrupted, will have a big impact on the US as well.
And I want to open it up to questions, because I know there are a lot of people out there who have thoughts and things they want to ask about this. But before I do, we're no longer talking about, when you talk about supply chain disruptions, et cetera, we're no longer talking about the future. It's happening now, right?
Yeah. Right.
And in big ways. Is it reversible?
I don't think it's, I actually don't think it's reversible, but I don't think it's just because of what's happening with the administration right now. I think it's inevitable. I mean, our US policy towards China hasn't changed significantly in the last 40 years, and it needed to be readjusted. I mean, there are underlying national security issues that we have with the rise of a stronger and a more military, powerful and economically powerful China. And so there were issues that needed to be addressed on that front as well as on the trade front. But we haven't yet settled on a clear policy, and we need to find a way to work together, because China isn't going away, and the United States can't ignore it, and we can't contain it.
So complete decoupling is not possible.
Right, and I think that there's a recognition in the United States now that that can't happen. I mean, the biggest challenge was that the business community support for China disappeared.
Right.
And once that happened, the politicians swooped in and became the leaders, and that's the voice that you hear. The business community now is realizing there's a big issue here, both for, as you were talking about, our underlying national security and economic security and their future, and they have to find a way to work together, but the soybean exports aren't going to come back. The farming community is going to be hit, and across the board, we're going to see a major change in trade flows.
Yeah. Question? Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I see decoupling actually is bringing an benefit to China. People in technology, including myself, have not been unhappy about it, in the sense that before the trade war, there was a unwarranted contempt in the Chinese society about its economic achievement. And suddenly there's a trade war. Everyone thought this is a wake-up call as to how lagged behind China is. And suddenly there's a need to catch up.
So you're focusing on weaknesses, gaps.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
really
it's being forced, but it's not a bad thing. And a lot of for China. And the semiconductor firms, a lot of the young startups, before they had no chance to try Huawei or Zhongxin, but suddenly they are all invited by their supply chain people. Yeah.
We have a question or a comment right over here. Please identify yourself first.
So ladies and gentlemen, I'm from MoSeeker, and my name is Henry. So our company actually is an AI company who serve both European clients, US clients, as well as the China state-owned companies, and we are in the HR tech industry. So first I want to confirm that this is the best panel of the day, so far from my personal point of view. Secondly, when you talk about tech war, but from as a player in tech, so I personally feel it's more about data control war. You know, everything coming to the policy, to the regulatory, and to the control, it will be reflected as data security. And when you talk about data privacy, I heard a lot of words that data is an asset, is even a currency in the morning. So from the different background on the stage, I do have want this question to be heard to hear from you from the different capital investment or academy or even political. What do you see in the long term, where tech is evolution, generates massive data? However, every field you have different perspective or expectation to control the data and being saved for the future, I don't know, valuation or for policy or for whatever. But for all of you, what do you see as a trend at current time when you just want to forecast the future, the data control, how it will be impact?
It's got to be very difficult for you facing different data rules in every market.
For the record, we are GDPR compliance company in China. So we have been really set up our strategy in advance.
Who wants to take that on?
Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think that's a huge issue. And so I think the worst potential aspect of decoupling is if we're in two completely different data worlds. So there has been discussion in the U.S., for example, of controlling AI training data sets going to China, right, as part of sort of this concern over AI and data. So I think it's interesting to hear that you're GDPR compliant. I've heard this from a number of Chinese companies. I think the problem is still going to be how do, for example, EU regulators react to this, because China itself will probably never be deemed adequate as a country, as Japan has been during recent negotiations. But Chinese companies are operating globally, and they're internally they are complying. But so far we haven't seen the EU regulators to really tackle that issue. And I think AI is a particularly good example where we have lots of clients who are transferring data sets globally and don't want to be in an environment where they have to deal with such different laws. So the real key here is compliance and interoperability. So the US and, for example, the EU have Privacy Shield, we have GDPR, we have the CBPR and APEC. These are ways of having some kind of compliance with some standard, independent standard, and then that facilitates interoperability. And that's the world that we need to have. But the problem is the WTO and other trade organizations, for example, that haven't been able to deal with this on a global basis. And so we have this sort of patchwork of data regimes. And I think that's going to be a big problem going forward. It could be an opportunity also if there can be some alternative setup to that would be adhered to globally. But we're in a real critical point now where that's the future of decoupling is really the biggest part of this is data.
And I would just say quickly on data, if you talk to the people from the Google Next Billion Users team, they'll tell you that the future of data and the data that's going to train the algorithms that are ultimately going to determine the future of the internet is coming from emerging technology markets. It's not coming from standard use cases in mature markets like Western Europe and North America. And so if American companies like Google and Facebook lose access to these emerging technology markets through this decoupling exercise, they will no longer be able to shape the trajectory of where the internet goes.
Emerging markets more than China?
China is kind of the gateway now to India, to Southeast Asia, to the Middle East and Africa.
Fascinating. Yeah. One other question or comment out there? If not, let me ask each of you to put on look into your crystal balls, take us 10 years out. What is this world going to look like in terms of technology, data, et cetera? Paul, I'll make you go first.
Well, I think there's two possibilities. One is that...
Oh, no.
There's a short-term...
You got to pick one.
Pick one. Well, I'm short-term pessimistic that we're going to get further decoupling, but I think in the long run, I think we'll have different political considerations 10 years from now. China will be a very different place. It's very different than the country I landed in 30 years ago. So I think I tend to be short-term pessimistic and long-term optimistic.
We're going to work all this out and be happily working together for everyone's benefit. You are a wonderful optimist. Deborah, 10 years out.
I tend to be an optimist also. I think that we'll be forced to deal with some of the global governance issues, which will find a way to bring kind of international groups together to find new rules of the road for working on data.
Amazing, amazing. Ben, you going to buy into that?
This isn't an optimism question for me. This is just a question of what the world looks like.
Yeah,
I see a bifurcated, balkanized world. There's still interoperability. There are still American companies to do well, but there will be a substantial rebalancing of where the technology, power, and giants sit, and I think it will be more kind of migrated in this direction.
Gia?
I'm quite optimistic as well. I think 10 years down the road, China would be more of an equal partner in terms of the technology war. And because of that, US cannot just throw out semiconductor as a nuclear weapon, and will therefore be forced to be more collaborative.
Well, good. Well, thank you for that bracing dose of both realism and optimism. Appreciate it. Good panel.